Thanks so much. So Ben Spielberg, he's making his second appearance on Left Reckoning, co-founder of 34 Justice, characterized as a sort of political email list. Ben,
What, 34 Justice?
right? Yeah,
I'd say a political blog.
political blog. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just want to talk a little bit about. I saw some tweets that Ben was firing off in the wake of, or as the Infrastructure Reduction Act was being passed. And before we get to that, let's play this clip from Bernie Sanders. Uh, and it, a lot of people were getting upset with Bernie here, and I just want Ben to explain for folks what Bernie was doing and not doing.
I'm going to take a moment to say a few words about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that we are debating this evening. And I say so-called, by the way, because according to the CBO and other economic organizations who have studied this bill, it will in fact have a minimal impact on inflation.
Okay, so Ben, with that, and we also played the clip of Bernie on Ali Velshi talking about, it's a modest step forward. Can you give us the sort of best spin on the half loaf, quote unquote? I'm hearing a lot go around what we actually got in this bill from your perspective, and let's start with the positive first.
Okay, yeah. Well, and I would say, I think I wouldn't use the phrase half loaf, because I think if you just look at the spending or the revenue side of this bill, if we're looking at what Bernie originally proposed, you're talking about 7% to 12% of a loaf. And even if you're looking at what Joe Biden and Democratic Party leadership said was their agenda, again, their statement of what they theoretically wanted, we've got 12 to 21% of a loaf. So we've got a pretty small piece of bread here, based on what Democratic Party leaders said that they wanted. But there's really three components of this bill. There's taxes, provisions on taxes, there's provisions on healthcare, and then there's provisions on climate. Just to talk about what some might view positively, on the taxes side, which I actually think is the strongest kind of clear-cut positive case that you can make, there's investment in increased services for the IRS. And generally, studies find that when you increase funding for the IRS, particularly enforcement funding, which the bulk of this funding is, you make back the money 4 times over. So every $1 in increased IRS funding leads to $4 of increased government revenue, because it helps the IRS enforce the law on rich tax cheats primarily. So people who are breaking the law and evading their taxes, that's a problem that this bill will help to address to some degree. There's also a 15% minimum tax on corporations. Right now, legally, many corporations can avoid paying anything in federal taxes because there's so many deductions, credits, et cetera, that they can take. This bill for some of the largest corporations would provide a minimum tax rate of 15%. So Amazon, for example, couldn't pay 0% in a given year. They would have to pay at least 15% is the idea. And then there's a 1% excise tax on stock buybacks, which is when companies basically, instead of investing in anything productive, they just enrich their shareholders. There's now, with the Inflation Reduction Act, if it passes the House and is signed into law by Biden, there's also a tax there that is positive in terms of curbing some bad behavior from wealthy individuals. So I think that stuff is, there's definitely some downsides to elements of it relative to what could have passed. But that stuff's generally pretty decent if you're somebody who's progressive. If you look at the healthcare part of the bill and the climate parts of the bill, I think this is where the 7 to 12% loaf of what Bernie originally proposed gets less clearly positive. But if you want to be positive about it, what you can say is for 3 years, you're extending subsidies in the Affordable Care Act that reduce premium costs for some people who buy healthcare on the insurance exchanges created under Obamacare. And you give the government the ability through Medicare to negotiate drug prices directly for a limited number of drugs in 2026. So those are kind of the two provisions on the healthcare side that people would say, may be a positive thing. And again, there are downsides to those things that we should talk about. And then on the climate side, there are generally, on the kind of positive front, there's a slew of incentives in the tax code. So tax credits, primarily tax credits, that allow consumers to buy an electric car, make home improvements that are greener, that incentivize businesses. It makes it cheaper for businesses to make investments in green technology. So that, is something that you could say, okay, that's likely to help with the climate change issue to some degree. And then there are also some investments, although they're a relatively small portion of the climate investments. Most of them are tied up in the tax credits on direct investments in clean energy stuff. In the agriculture industry is probably the biggest part of those. But again, they're a pretty small portion of that climate funding. Most of it is for these tax credits. And then there are some bad pieces of the environmental piece. But if you were trying to only paint the positive picture, that's the stuff that you would highlight.
I want to get to the climate stuff more in depth in a second, but I was just wondering, Ben, if you wouldn't mind, because like something I've seen sort of floating around Twitter has been, a bit of an actual opposition to some of this IRS funding, because I think most people sort of have an understanding that the IRS seems to come after working class and poorer, lower wage earners more than they do hyper rich people. Could you just maybe put some minds at ease about, what this, this extra funding, will end up meaning, and not necessarily being something that's going to mean that the IRS is going to be coming down really hard on you?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, generally speaking, it's easier to audit somebody who's not rich than somebody who is rich. Which is very unfortunate. And the IRS oftentimes does tend to, focus on things like, there are a lot of lawmakers, particularly Republican lawmakers, who really want to, for example, go after supposed fraud in programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. The IRS has said with this increased funding, they aren't increasing audit rates on low and middle income people. It's really targeted towards enforcement of the rich, which generally speaking, the more resources the IRS has for enforcement, the more able they are to fight the tax lawyers and go after people who have much more complicated tax bills. So I do think this funding is a good thing. It is going to be targeted at rich individuals. I do think the IRS should not focus on low and middle income people in their tax audits. And this funding is geared towards going after the rich.
That's been the funniest, like Steven Crowder said, they're coming after you. It's like, well, if we all agree that they should be going after rich people, let's like write that into the statutory clause, or like let's agree. But there's not actually agreement there, because the people that are really upset about this are upset that they're going to go after very wealthy people's taxes.
Yeah, but honestly, that's something I'd be willing to take, because, generally also when you're talking about lower or middle income people, the issues with their taxes are usually mistakes or things because the tax code is super confusing, that something went awry when they were filing. But they're not generally people trying to cheat on their taxes. That's much more common that you'll find among the rich.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the ACA, because that's what this sort of felt like. I've seen a few podcasts. Best of the Left do a good show. They did a sort of positive take on this, and it was this is a big climate deal, and it was like Joe Biden talking about the ACA, and we've seen. I don't want to say obviously the ACA has provisions that were extremely helpful in giving material aid to people. But it also didn't get us to Medicare for all, for instance. And I remember there's a whole lot, the way this conversation is happening, it's as if we're on the way there. And, we've seen, we're old enough to have seen how that worked out with healthcare, that no, actually we're still going on parallel tracks with some members of the party leadership. Okay, so let's start talking about what's missing that we really should have included in this loaf, and then we can talk about why that's gone.
Got it. Well, and can we first just mention kind of what's bad about the climate provisions? So, and kind of what I think has been a problem in the mainstream narrative about the climate provisions. So, a lot of what's been cited in a lot of the media about the climate provisions is this number of 40% and this projected reduction of the climate provisions of 40% in greenhouse gases beneath the 2005 levels by 2030. You'll see that in many news reports and many tweets about this bill being the biggest climate bill ever. What they don't tell you with that number are two things. One is that the baseline projection, if there's no policy change, is generally around 25 to 30%, depending upon what your analysis is that you're looking at. So the models that they're using actually predict a reduction already. 40% is the inclusion of the Inflation Reduction Act number, but it's not that far above baseline. And in fact, there are some models, they have relatively wide confidence intervals because they're uncertain. And the confidence intervals overlap. And what that means, again, is, one analysis, for example, from the Rhodium Group, there's a chance, based on their analysis, with no policy change, that you actually have a greater greenhouse gas emission reduction than with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. They think it's likely that the Inflation Reduction Act will reduce emissions further, but in their model, there's definitely scenarios in which the Inflation Reduction Act passes and we're not reducing climate change by as much as could have happened if nothing passed. So I think that that's important to note. The other piece that's really important to note about these models and about what's in the bill. So the bill includes a requirement that you lease land to oil and gas companies before you can do, for example, offshore wind. And that, in terms of its modeling impact, is actually discounted quite heavily in the models. So one of the models, again, that I read says that in the worst case scenario, they assume that that federal land for oil and gas is only going to lead to 25% consumption of whatever's produced, because they think, and they say that's the worst case. They say in the regular case, it's not likely to lead to any additional oil and gas consumption because they think that the supply is going to be offset by reductions in the private sector or in other countries, which is just a crazy kind of baseline assumption and worst case assumption. So the models undercount the bad stuff, which is like there's giveaways to oil and gas. The models also don't include the effects of the side deal that Democratic Party leaders struck with Joe Manchin to build a fracked gas pipeline, which should have pretty big climate impact. So it doesn't include those downside effects. And probably on the tax credits that I talked about, the effects that they assume are way too rosy, because for a lot of those tax credits, the people who are benefiting from them, they might have considered going green with whatever they were buying anyway. So it's not, and a lot of them are pretty small bore, like the electric vehicle tax credit. It's a $7,500 tax credit. For a lot of cars, like that's not a huge percentage of the price. So like a lot of people, that's not going to really change whether they're likely to buy an electric car or not. So what I would say about the climate provisions in this bill, it's not clear to me that it's really going to make any sort of a climate impact. The models don't project a huge climate impact, and they way undercount the bad stuff and probably overcount the good stuff in the bill. So I'd be very skeptical of any claims you hear about the climate effects of the bill. And then on the healthcare side, as you mentioned, Matt, this is a bill that really entrenches the power of private industry, because the ACA subsidies that it extends are a huge giveaway to the insurance companies. They really do reduce premiums for some people, but they do so by the government paying the insurance companies the cost of those premiums. And the plans themselves that those people have access to are really bad, with high copays and deductibles. And so if you get sick, even if you have one of those plans, you're going to end up paying a ton of money. So I don't think the healthcare and climate provisions are huge wins in this bill. And my personal view, again, is that progressives made a mistake in accepting this bill, let alone celebrating it. But sorry, I know we should get to your other question of what's not in the bill.
Well, could I just add one thing too? Because I highly suggest people go and after the law on the show, read the work of Matt Huber, like particularly on like the tax provisions, because this is such a favorite tool of the Democratic Party, is to use tax credits as a way to try to spur social investment. And I know we're not in power right now, so sometimes it can feel a little funny to talk about what we should be doing, but it is what we should be doing. We should be investing in green technologies that go to the public, not to into the hands of private interests. And a way that a lot of these tax credits end up working is that a company continues doing their same kind of stuff and they buy offsets from another company that might have not even really been polluting in the first place. So it's a little bit of like moving things around in the ledger, too, apart from the fact that it's just not bold enough to change people's action. And then the way that some people read it is like, oh, we've invested billions of dollars into green energy, when it's just like, well, Walmart's paying some other company to some money for their tax credits that offset their activities.
I think that's a great point.
Let's unless you got something to say on that, Ben.
No, go for it.
Let's talk about, before we get into what's missing. I do think let's ready to talk about how this was passed. And just before to set the table for that, you had this tweet here, which is the one that I wanted to bring you on, where I saw like Democratic senators are more united in telling Bernie Sanders that he needs to let go of dental and hearing benefits for seniors than they were in telling Joe Manchin he needs to drop goodies for oil companies or accept cash payments for families. And you have a series of tweets here, Brian Schatz. Basically, we have a deal to take the biggest climate action in U.S. history, which I'll just comment then call it that. Like not the Inflation Reduction Act, they call it the Civil Rights Act, like the Civil Rights Act, right? Like it'd be easier to believe you if you weren't so shy about it. But Cory Booker again, basically all these people saying, I'll vote no on amendments, even the ones I agree with, to protect this bill. So just talk about the passage of this bill a little bit, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mentioned before, if we're talking about what Bernie proposed, it's 7 to 12% of a loaf. If we're talking about what Democratic Party leaders said that they wanted, it's 12 to 21% of a loaf. And the reason that I said that is because, I don't think anybody expected, realistically, Bernie Sanders to get the bill that he wanted passed, because Bernie Sanders is one senator and he didn't win the presidency. And we know we're operating with a Democratic Party that is not particularly progressive. So, I think while I would love for Bernie Sanders' bill to pass, I understand that that's not super likely because Bernie Sanders doesn't control everything in the Senate. But Joe Biden again said that his bill was the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better investment. Democratic Party leaders, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, they said that their preference was the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better bill, and that was Joe Biden's agenda. And that was a year ago. And during that time, progressives made this pledge that they were not going to vote for the bill, the bipartisan infrastructure deal that Joe Manchin really wanted, unless they also got Joe Biden's bill, the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better agenda. Now, I already had some problems with what the $3.5 trillion had in it and didn't have in it. Mm-hmm. But it seemed like, progressives were saying, we're going to hold strong. We're going to get the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better deal because it's not even our agenda. It's the Democratic Party's agenda. And it's going to be coupled with this infrastructure deal. What happened, as I know you guys know and have talked about in the past, is that Democratic Party leaders said we need to pass the infrastructure bill now, with just kind of a verbal commitment from the more conservative Democrats that they're going to pass Build Back Better. Progressives decided to go along with that. And then what happened, very predictably, Build Back Better was sidelined after the infrastructure bill passed and Joe Manchin and the other conservative Democrats had what they wanted. I think that was extremely predictable. What I said at the time, and again, this was back in 2021, is this doesn't mean that nothing's going to pass. The Democratic Party wants to pass something and they want to celebrate what they call a win in front of the midterms in 2022. So something is likely going to pass. But it's going to be the bill that Joe Biden, that Nancy Pelosi, that Chuck Schumer, the bill that they actually wanted, even though that they were selling that they wanted this $3.5 trillion bill, because Joe Manchin provided a very convenient way for them to say, look, we want this other bill. Unfortunately, because Joe Manchin now is not going to support it, we've got to pare stuff back. They're going to work and they're going to figure out something pretty close to what they actually want, which is what Joe Manchin wants, which is something substantially smaller. That is a corporate giveaway. And they're going to pass that and they're going to tell progressives, you just need to accept it or you're not going to get anything. And that's exactly what happened, right? I mean, that is the Inflation Reduction Act. It is Joe Manchin, Chuck Schumer coming forward. Again, it was billed as a surprise. Manchin all of a sudden supports something. But I think if we look a year ago, we could say this is not a surprise at all. we knew they were going to come with something, and they were going to tell progressives, this is all you're getting. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have veto power. Progressives, you just need to go along with it if you want anything to help people. And that is what we got.
And I mean, I just think like the collection of tweets you have, Cory Booker coming out, who else? Senator Alex Padilla. Like you never saw this when they was threatening the with like when Biden or when Manchin was threatening the combination of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better. You never saw them saying, "Hey guys, we all got to all keep this together." It's and that's like why people suspect like there's more than just Manchin and Sinema, and this is actually a leadership of the House and Senate problem.
Yes, and I think the key point there to me is because there were people who complained about Manchin, right? Like there were mainstream Democratic Party actors who complained about Manchin. Even the White House put out something saying, Manchin's reneging on his commitments. But there's a difference between using your actual power and just using rhetoric to complain because it's actually helpful for you what Joe Manchin is doing. So like when it comes to Bernie Sanders, right, he's going to put forward these amendments. All the senators are united in voting against the amendments because they're just saying to Bernie, look, you're going to vote for the final bill without the amendments. That's what you're going to do. They did not do that for Manchin and Sinema. They said, oh, this is terrible. Manchin and Sinema opposed the bill. We can't pass anything. They didn't go to Manchin and Sinema and say, no, you're gonna support the bill because we're not going to give you the infrastructure deal unless you support the bill. Or you're going to support the bill because you're not going to get funding from the DSCC if you don't support the bill. They didn't try any of that, right? So I think the big difference, it's not in the rhetoric so much because they do say, oh, man, we really wanted to do this. It was Manchin and Sinema holding it up. It's that there are clear levers of power that Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi have that they do not use on Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, but they do use on progressives. They say, you're not getting anything unless you vote for it. So you better vote for it.
How afraid should progressives be of that threat? I mean, I guess we all agree here. And thanks for vindicating David and I's nomination of Jayapal as the Bumster of the Year last year for splitting those bills up. But should I guess what you're thinking of? We got to be able to say no and deal with what they throw at us.
Yes, well, and it's a really tough, I think this is a legitimate debate for progressives to have, and it's an important one to have, because it is really tough when you see something on the table that is for millions of people going to make a difference, not a huge, super meaningful difference, and it is going to entrench a system that is horrible for millions more people in the long run. But in the near term, people are hurting. You want to get them as much help as you can. And that is clearly like Bernie Sanders' calculus, right? The reason that he votes for this bill is because his view is, I can get some premium help for people who are relying on Obamacare. I can get some prescription drug costs lowered in 2026. I can get some clean energy provisions, and I can get some taxes on the rich. That's better than nothing. And he's right? Like if I look today versus tomorrow, or today versus the day the Inflation Reduction Act passes, we are in an objectively short-term better state the day that it passes than we are today. But I think the fallacy of that reasoning, and the reason I really push progressives on this, is if everybody knows that's our perspective, that we will always take something as long as it helps somebody, even if it's really terrible and entrenches a system in the long run that makes the real change that we need much harder, we will always only get something and we will never change the system because everybody knows we're a pushover. Bernie Sanders can say until he's blue in the face, here are the amendments that I want in the bill. But nobody's going to listen to him because they already know he's going to vote for the bill in the end. So why do they need to listen to him? They don't. Unless they're aligned with him, which they are not, they're not going to. And so I think if you want to exercise your power, you really do need to be able to say, these things are non-negotiable. I will not vote for a bill that does not include these things. And if you do not do that, then you basically are removing all of your power for yourself. So I think part of the problem progressives have to deal with is something everybody acknowledges. We're up against huge institutional obstacles. But part of the problem, too, is like you guys said with your award for Jayapal, is progressives are using bad strategy over and over again because they're thinking always in terms of the short term getting something rather than the long term. How do I build a strategy so that I can effectively wield power and get more of what I want?
Yeah. And I think that's important because, I think, look, like you said, like I can grant certain realities about this being something being better than nothing, or it being better that Biden was in office to do this instead of whatever Trump. But like at a certain point, you need to move beyond that, because it's not getting us to any sort of place we're supposed to be. I mean, is there anything in your wish list that we should be going for? I mean, I hear Biden should be calling a climate emergency. We should be nationalizing fossil fuel industries. We could just buy those with the Federal Reserve Bank. What comes to your mind?
Well, so, the thing that I was thinking a year ago that progressives should have said, and this was even before they kind of reneged on their tethering of the infrastructure bill and Build Back Better, was a robust expansion of public insurance. Because we're in the middle of a pandemic. To me, healthcare is a salient issue, and it's a hugely important issue for millions of people. So my thinking was, if progressives could have gotten something that Joe Biden says he supports, Chuck Schumer says he supports, Nancy Pelosi says she supports, and hundreds of Democrats in the House and the Senate combined say they support, which is expanding the Medicare eligibility age to at least 60, or having a robust public option. To me, I would have said, okay, as a progressive, you can vote for that bill because that meaningfully advances us to universal health care. It doesn't give you everything you want, but you actually are making huge inroads on the system of healthcare in the United States and moving it towards a public system. That to me would have been a big non-negotiable. Progressives never did that, unfortunately. I think that was a bummer. The thing that I think is crazy that nobody did for this bill, and it'll be interesting to see if we get it later, but the child tax credit improvements is something that like more kind of, I would say, mainstream Democratic organizations touted heavily as bringing a dramatic reduction in poverty. These are cash payments to families with children. And, I talked to some people who work kind of more in Democratic policy circles still, because I used to, but I have friends who still work in that, around the time of the negotiations last year. And I said, okay, fine. Like, I know your philosophy is often you'll take something, but you guys have to have some sort of a bright line. So what would need to be removed from the bill for you to say, no, we're not going to vote for it? And I had actually one person told me, look, if the child tax credit comes out, probably I would say we shouldn't support it. But now that we're here a year later, the message is, okay, that's out and that sucks, but we'll work to get that later and we should still support the bill. And my view again is, no, you have no negotiating power, right? Like if you're going to not take a firm stand, this has to be in the bill or I won't vote against it, then you're going to lose time and time again, because when circumstances change and something rolls around and you're handed, a 12th of a loaf, you're just everybody knows you're going to accept it. So you have to break that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, the pantomime that we saw at the end of the bill where, what's Manchin going to get? Okay, we're seeing the criminology. Like it looks like Manchin might be a yes if he gets certain goodies. And now we have to throw it to cinema. That shows who had the actual power there in a way. And it wasn't like, oh, we got to make sure Bernie Sanders is okay with this, because we knew that if Bernie's going to do that, every senator was going to be like, I agree with everything Bernie's ever said in his life, but we got to, keep this moving along here.
Exactly. And I mean, again, part of that is there's a real structural thing there where, Manchin and Sinema are Republican-esque, and either you get some Republicans or you get Manchin and Sinema, and that's the direction theoretically you have to move. But the thing that is also true is part of the reason Sanders is irrelevant is because of our own choices as progressives, where we signal, we'll take it. In the end, we'll take whatever you give us. So I think we got to break that dynamic. We are up against real institutional obstacles. There's a lot of work to be done to build more progressive power in Congress. But the progressives who are already in Congress, they do have more power than they act like they have a lot of the time. And it's because they just sacrifice it away. And you can understand why, but they really need to change something if they want to start getting some wins.
Can I ask you, I know this is a broad question, but one of the things that's sort of tough about this when we're talking about quote unquote progressives in Congress, it's that's a very loose set of individuals. So I think agree on some things and maybe really disagree on others. I mean, could you give anyone a slight picture as to how much even real coordination that there is between all of these different figures, because I think that's that's an institution that I think is tremendously lacking. And I don't know if it could be built with the current cohort. But
yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think in the Senate, it's really Bruni stands alone most of the time. I mean, you have a couple senators who are better than some of the others, but Bruni's really the only one who's hardcore trying to fight for people. In the House, you have a broader contingent of people. So, I think you think about the squad, you think about some of the newer people who are elected into that. So like when you think about Cori Bush, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, AOC, Jamal Bowman, even you have, and I would say Ro Khanna, for example, too. Like these are actual real progressive people. Pramila Jayapal, the people who endorsed Bernie in 2020. This is a contingent that if they stuck together on things, they would have some real power. But I think, like you said, David, there's not always an indication that they are as coordinated as they could or should be. And I do think that is something to pay attention to, because the Congressional Progressive Caucus contains a lot of non-progressives. There's a much smaller wing of the Congressional Progressive Caucus that actually creates or includes people who have legitimately good views on a lot of stuff, but they don't seem to stand together and wield their power as a group as much as they need to.
Yeah, and I mean, just from a programming note, I mean, I think that's the thing that needs to be emphasized among the left right now. I know that like people are pretty sensitive to there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats, folks, but I think that we need to like move beyond that and just say like we need to start pushing that the Democrats that do have our ear in a way that shows a backbone.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, again, I think it's good to be really critical of our greatest friends. Again, I think I said this in one of my tweets, like I love Bernie. I think he's great. I appreciate that he's really the one person in the Senate who actually fights for people. But I still think he had the wrong strategy here, because everybody knew that he was going to vote for this bill in the end. So I think we've got to be willing to be hard on our friends. We've got to be able to recognize that there are differences in degree between different Democrats, between certain Democrats and certain Republicans, but we've got to push the people who are aligned with us on a lot of these policies to actually use an effective strategy.
Absolutely. Ben Spielberg is at Ben Spielberg on Twitter. Folks, give him a follow. Thanks so much for making time for us tonight, Ben.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's great, and apologies for the technical issues.
All good. I'm just relieved we were able to get you. So give Ben a follow. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
There's certain nights where certain things happen and certain people just take over, and Ben was just on a roll.
No, he's. It's good to get that kind of inside perspective. Not that he's an insider in that way anymore. Well, like somebody who knows how those structures work. Right,
he's concerned with details, like actually, like as opposed to just kind of I don't want to be cynical. I don't want to tear others down to build Ben up, but Ben's really great at analyzing this stuff in a way that I think is productive.